it comes about at a time when no amount of perception of the current conditions, personal, social, economic, reveal anything like a positive outcome. Mm-hmm. And this is where like genuine religious hope has kind of value. It's a hope against hope.
Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. And hope is the topic of this episode, hope in relation to AI. When thinking about AI, what does it mean for Christians to have hope? Do we despair that AI will destroy the economy? Or do we put our hope in the possibilities of AI to make the world a better place? The best person to guide us in these questions is Professor Michael Burdett, who has spent his whole career thinking about technology and Christian views of the future. This episode is packed with provocative insights about how Christian hope can transform how we think about AI, and I hope you enjoy listening. Welcome back to Faith at the Frontiers, and in this episode we are joined by Professor Michael Burdett of the University of Nottingham. Hello, Michael.
Hello, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Now, this is the last episode where we're going to interview somebody on AI. And, long before the world became sort of fascinated by LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude, you were already researching Christian responses to AI. And before that, you were researching the theology of technology more broadly. So I saw in your first book, published in 2015, you said that you don't want to focus on one particular technology like cars or the internet or whatever, but just think about technology from a Christian perspective, technology as such. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it had a lot to do with the way in which I would situate my particular approach to it, which I was really trying to stay away from applied ethical approaches that you might find, in the 1980s, with designer babies or, the atom bomb, those kinds of things. And whilst I think that attending to like specific technologies and the ethics of it are really important, in fact, increasingly my work, especially in the area of AI, is focusing on those issues. It just struck me that there was something much larger as a cultural force, right, was really important that we needed to kind of attend to. And so we could bring philosophical theology, dogmatics, this kind of thing, as being an important focal area for those other areas.
Yeah, I think that's taking that step back and looking in the abstract at what our own age is doing technologically across the board is really, really important for situating all of those specific conversations. But you have also turned your attention to some AI-specific questions. But I'm just interested to know, what was it like for you with your previous technology sort of theology of technology hat on when in 2023 the sort of world exploded with all of these thoughts about LLMs and ChatGPT? What was it like for you? Did you feel like people were being alarmist, or did you feel like there was really something new happening, or did you feel like it was a lot of the same conversations that have been had every other new technology?
Yeah, so my PhD supervisor, George Pattison, retired to a very small Spanish fishing village. And I remember going to visit him probably around that time in 2022, 2023. And, sitting across from him at a pub. And the first thing he says to me is, "How does it feel that everything you've written about has essentially come to pass?" and my response was terrifying. But it does feel a little bit like, certainly my motivations for doing this were because I thought that there was something important to be said, and that I thought the direction of travel was such that certainly academic theology needed to be attending to it, because I thought it was a real possibility, that it was, as I often refer to it, the sleeping giant that no one was kind of considering and thinking about. And whether this was because, I grew up in California and Silicon Valley, I got to kind of experience this on my doorstep,
Yeah, that's interesting. You grew up right in the sort of heart of where it all began.
Yeah. Well, and also like in the kind of 90s, right? With I'm a child that remembers not having a computer in my house to then, a modem, instant messenger. I kind of grew up at the same time that the technology itself was information technology was really starting to influence kind of the wider prevailing culture, right? And so I think that probably made a really big difference to the way that I approached it, because I think it was something which was something I felt personal.
Mm.
But yeah, but I certainly said to George that it does feel terrifying. And is there anything kind of new that's happening, right? Was there something that I thought needed to be attended to with the rise of these LLMs? I mean, because prior to that, most of what I was focusing on was on biotechnology. So CRISPR-Cas9, so the same kinds of questions around theological anthropology, the environment, what does it mean to be human, was all in the domain of what does it mean that we can change at such a fundamental level of our own human genomes, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that explains some of your transhumanist focus as well, looking at
Exactly.
enhancing the human.
Yeah, but information technology had always been kind of alongside that as something which was kind of important. But you're right, by that point, AI was still something that was in the background of people's. It wasn't forefronted as a kind of major concern, right, in the general populace.
That's right. So you've written a lot about how Christians, when thinking about AI, should take both proximate concerns and ultimate concerns into account when thinking through the ethics of it. Could you just explain what you mean by a proximate concern and an ultimate concern and the difference between them?
Yeah, of course. A lot of this probably is kind of derived from some of that very early work, as you've just so helpfully put it, Barney, of what I was trying to attend to in the first book on eschatology and the technological future. It seemed to me that so much of theological writings early on were focused on those kind of proximate concerns. So what is the impact of a particular technology on a specific group of people, right? We might consider the social impact, the political impact, the personal
people
impact.
Losing their jobs, that kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly.
People getting addicted to it.
Yeah, exactly. What might be the impact of in vitro fertilization, right, as a technology, a technique, impact, marriage or the human person or particular kinds of societies. So that proximate is really just what is the kind of near-term impact, whereas like the ultimate concerns are the kinds of issues of ontology, what is reality, right? Maybe really big meta-theological or metaphysical questions around what is the nature of the human person. There's actually been a little bit of work I've done on the ontology of information, right? So this is the kind of the philosophy of information, the way in which we conceive of all of reality, not in terms necessarily of material or spirit, but what's most fundamental is information, and what does that kind of mean, right? So that might be a kind of ultimate concern, the way in which this kind of technologies develop, that we see ourselves, the environment, most primarily as information, right? So
it radically transforms how we understand ourselves and the world that we're in. And that makes it sort of ultimate in a way that those specific things aren't. Yeah, okay.
I'm often struck when people talk today about, I was listening to, a couple of sort of well-known figures talk about sort of, optimism and pessimism. And when they talked about their sense of where we're at as humans, it was primarily about technology. And I realize that this has become very common, right? That in our culture, when we think about sort of our, have we developed as humans? What's our society like? We think in terms of sort of technological progress and development. And it's interesting because that partly feels, I think, often inevitable. It's sort of like the technology is inevitably going this direction. The question is just, what do we do with it? But it also is this sense of like, that is our development as a species. And I'm just surprised that people have a hard time sort of disentangling these questions. But it is because they're bound up in really complex ways, right? these things do change us in some deep sense, but not necessarily in the sense that like we've progressed because we developed new technologies. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about like, how do you think about that framing, and where does sort of theology enter that conversation?
Yeah. It reminds me of, oh gosh, what was I reading recently? Oh, one of my favorite Substacks by Elam Sakasis, The Convivial Society. And he was talking about how AI is shifting our understanding of language. And he told this story about how Tolkien was being interviewed by someone in the BBC, many decades ago. And they asked him, like, what is it about these stories, or what are your underlying motivations that make you tick? And he said, and he got, just flabbergasted that this person had made this this metaphor of describing him as if he would tick, as if he were, a clock.
Oh, he didn't like the idea of ticking.
Yeah, so they said this is an unsuitable kind of metaphor to kind of understand, what a kind of human being is. And it strikes me that there's a lot of value in kind of considering the ways in which the different technologies in vogue at a particular kind of time become the basis for our own kind of understanding of ourselves and reality, right?
We start to conceive ourselves as our technologies or as computers.
Yeah, and whether that's because we want, certainly written about this in relation to the Imago Dei, but like, is it driven by this desire to see how we are different and distinct from other things in the created order, right? Mm. Is it from a place of kind of pride or even theological kind of interest, right? Or is it also just, maybe there's something that's even kind of more basic, that's just, we are porous to the environment in which we dwell and our artifacts, right? I mean, I'm sitting in this room and the amount of man-made, human-made objects surrounding me kind of make up that environment much more than, kind of natural objects. And so it kind of becomes the stuff of our imaginations. And this is one of the things that I talk a lot about in that first book, as Charles Taylor says, our social imaginaries, right? To become the conditions for how we might understand not just ourselves, but our relation to the rest of reality. And part of what I was trying to get at there was like, well, how is that imaginary become technological? The way in which we dream and think about ourselves, taken on this kind of technological oeuvre.
Yeah, well, I think it happens all the time, and I think you're right. It's just people reach for the nearest thing, don't they? The thing that's they're most familiar with, that they see and hear all the time, and that's why you get people saying things like, "Oh, I'm just hardwired to do this," or "I'm programmed to act like that," or those kinds of metaphors with a computer. But I think you're right. It does sort of change how we understand ourselves, and so we need to pay careful attention to the metaphors we're using and to the implications of those metaphors. If you start using computer metaphors for yourself, you're sort of denying any free will, at least implicitly, right?
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, think about the language that we use to refer to this thing that commonly is called artificial intelligence. I was just talking with somebody yesterday in the Church of England who does a lot of work for the Archbishop and has to put together a lot of the theological briefs. And I think he's right. He said to me, I think a significant portion of our conundrum with AI might be disarmed. There's a great word used by the Pope, right? Well, by just calling it machine learning. Yeah. So the language that we use, and of course you have lots of people, right, in the secular realm trying to understand what this thing is, right? A stochastic parrot, a cultural technology. Like, what is this thing? And the way that we name it and the way we interact with it is going to shift the way that the kinds of questions that we ask of it, the way that we kind of use it, and the significance that we afford it.
Well, I think machine learning is what it was called
Yeah.
before 2023, right? I had friends working in software who were like, I'm working in machine learning. But now they don't say that. Now they say I'm working in AI, because that's what everybody knows. Everybody knows that word now.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, maybe this is just my, probably reveals a lot about what I think of the kind of philosophy of science. But or the way that marketing has kind of infiltrated into even the kinds of things that we study. That if you can be more provocative, you can, you'll probably get more money applying to various grant funding bodies if you say it's artificial intelligence rather than machine learning, right?
Yeah, you'll certainly get more attention. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that story of Tolkien. You got to be careful what metaphors you use around a master of metaphor and imagery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Mary Midgley was very good, I think, with this as well. Her great book, The Myths We Live By, attending to the language that we use about it. I mean, because the language is adjacent to that kind of myth speaking, the significance that it performs for us. I mean, this is all very recurrent, Barney, in a lot of ways. It really
I'm
is.
so glad to hear Paul Ricoeur come up and me not be the one who mentions him.
Well, I'm playing to the crowd.
Yeah, and it's very true, and I think the kinds of images that it gives us, and the sort of the way that we think about human progress. Yeah. We're talking all the time about like hacking your health or your whatever, and these ways of this. I think so much of the framing of who we are and who we're trying to become has become really, really tightly connected to these technological metaphors. And I think, just then AI, it's interesting how neatly that fits into that picture that was sort of already formed. And I think it's kind of a question of just like, is it just continuing that, or is it,
well, it just projects back. We've already thought of ourselves as machines in so much of our language. Then we create a machine, and then we project back our understanding ourselves onto that machine, which is why we think of AI as so similar to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, and a lot of this derives from the history of the development of the area itself, right? And whether do you have certain labs that are genuinely aiming for artificial general intelligence versus artificial narrow intelligence? And if they are,
you probably need to explain what you mean by those two things.
Yes, of course. Very, very, very good, Barney. Yeah. So artificial narrow intelligence is creating machine learning applications that are good in one particular domain. So creating some kind of AI that's very good at chess playing, but it's only good in that particular kind of domain. And in fact, that's the entire intention, or
that's
maybe
all it can do. Yeah.
That's all it can do. Right. And really, is that what our end goal, or is that the end goal of these engineers in developing AI? Right. And the thing is the kinds of impact that could have are quite substantial. Right. Mm-hmm. But there's also the kind of, elusiveness of artificial general intelligence. So rather than developing a particular application that is good at just doing chess or open heart surgery, or, I don't know, working on your car, creating something that is portable from one particular domain to another, right? So, it can help you around the house, with cleaning duties if it were in some kind of robotic, or maybe it can do your tasks.
It can just answer any question because its data set is the whole internet, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think what is being pursued also reveals that kind of nascent what you think the thing is at the same time, So if you are pursuing a kind of artificial general intelligence, is it that, is your motivation one that you're trying? Is it just because it is a more interesting problem and an achievement that you're trying to build? Is it because you want to create something, that is human-like? The motivations for that creative act reveal a kind of nascent what you think the thing is, and probably what you think you are, right?
Yeah, right. And what is the thing for? And
Yeah,
what are you for? And these things again get tied to, I mean, again, so much maybe our sense of efficiency being the point of everything is part of the outcome of this.
yeah.
It seems like that's the point of our technologies and increasingly the point of ourselves.
Yeah. And then the thing is you might have very different labs, right? The Chinese really want to focus and get this out in the real world. And so the artificial narrow intelligence is like, that's what we're aiming to do. Whereas, your premier labs, it's like, no, we want the best GPUs so that it can do everything under the
What's a
sun.
GPU for the uninitiated?
Yes, sorry, the GPU are the underlying mega processors that were one of the major reasons why we have this huge explosion of large language models. So GPU's graphics processing unit. So, if you are a gamer or are a gamer, NVIDIA is the company that develops the most sophisticated processors that are the basis for training the AI.
And how to deal with graphics and images.
Yeah, exactly. So that they were always just much better than your CPU.
Right. Now, a lot of your work has focused on technology in eschatological perspective.
Yeah.
Like, how does our technology shape how we understand the future, and how should Christians understand the future in relation to technology? So what would be some of your initial thoughts on how Christians should rightly think about AI with regard to the future?
I think in the first instance, I would counsel Christians to understand that this is an interesting moment. There's a great book by someone called Alvin Toffler in the 1960s called Future Shock, if anyone's ever kind of come across it before. But he's kind of making the claim that when you have this kind of exceeding pace of economic, technological, social development, you then start getting, this is when you start getting a lot of futurists kind of coming out of the woodwork, who are kind of like saying, we're really, because the future happens so much more, or things, in the intervening period, it seems like the future is coming much more quickly than we kind of think. So the future kind of becomes a topic of kind of public concern.
Because people are worried about the future because they feel like the pace of life is changing so fast, I guess. So I think to contrast that with something like maybe the antiquity, or even maybe in the medieval period, there was less of a sense that the future was a serious cause of concern because you just thought that most things are going to stay largely as they are.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think that's right. Of course, we get into different conceptions of time as they relate to kind of history, but our linear account of time rather than a kind of cyclical one, right, makes us kind of really potentially concerned about it because the future, we haven't lived that before, right? This isn't a kind of eternal return, a kind of recurrence that, we'll just, go back to living a little bit like the Greeks or something. But instead it is the kind of unknown, right? It's the messianic, right? And you can kind of talk about how much Christianity or Christian eschatology influenced this in the kind of, secularized public sense. Mm-hmm. But it
does open up the possibility of something radically new and unprecedented coming into the world, which is something that in ancient times, at least arguably, most people didn't really think that could happen or would happen.
Yeah, or at least their conception of it was that newness was something which seemed to be more of a kind of closed account of, right, the environment, time, et cetera, right? Which, of course, in Christianity, right, through liturgical accounts of time, we certainly have this kind of cyclical kind of understanding.
I mean, it's not completely an either or, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But certainly, Heilsgeschichte, holy salvation history, this idea of creation, fall, the second coming, beatific vision, et cetera, right? This accounting of what happens in kind of history as referring to things that actually happen in, theological account of time, kairos instead of chronos, right? Is
Just the sense that we're in a story that had a beginning and will have an end, and it's not just going to go on forever or just endlessly repeat itself.
Exactly. So, and in the one sense, I'd say like it provides us the opportunity to speak in just these terms. Where are we going? Mm-hmm. Why are we concerned about this thing rather than just, oh, I'm waking up and I'm doom scrolling. What's next? It's the platform by which we can start to ask more of those fundamental, ultimate questions about us and think about, is this right? Is where do I think things are going, or and whatnot, and then it opens up that kind of question of what is history for, where am I going, where's AI going,
I think it's really helpful to connect those sorts of fears for the future with a broader Christian picture that there is a future that's different to the past, because I think it shows how the average Christian who goes to church on a Sunday will probably believe that Jesus will come back and everything will be great. And, the union of heaven and earth. They might say we're all going to heaven when we die if they haven't read N.T. Wright. If they have read N.T. Wright, they'll say heaven's coming here. But either way, they think there's going to be a grand final ending of things, and then there will be no more pain, no more suffering. Jesus is going to conquer and triumph and everything will be great. Yeah. But that same Christian who goes to church on a Sunday will also be really fearful and worried about what AI is doing to our society, to higher education, to employment, and all of those kinds of things. And that worry about AI and that confidence in a Christian future both come from that same impulse that the future is going to be different to the present. I think that's sort of what you're driving at, isn't it?
That's exactly right, Barney. But it also helps us to kind of separate out the significance that we want to afford to the technology bringing about, right? Either, the apocalyptically terrible dystopian future versus, the potential kind of utopian one, right? And distinguishing between, is Christ's kingdom really just a kind of utopia, and what are the conditions of that kind of arrival? Is the future something which is just derived from things that are kind of past, and if we had a large enough machine to be able to understand these kinds of, this is the stuff of science fiction, right? Although as we've learned in the last 4 or 5 years, the science fiction and science fact are probably a lot more porous and closer together than we kind of think. But it also then invites Christians, I think, to think about what does that future entail and how might hope be derived, right, in relation to both our technological kinds of creations and God's relation to us and to those kinds of creations. And so a major point of some of the work I've done is futurum. So a Latin term for this kind of accounting of the future as that which is a product of the past, and usually a kind of imminent understanding that the future is just the entailments of the efficient causes of agents that have kind of happened in the past into the present and into kind of the future. It kind of turns.
So it's completely predictable.
It's
just sort of an unfolding of a carpet, and it's just what's going to happen on the basis of what has happened.
Exactly. And so a lot of transhumanists like Raymond Kurzweil, will say we have to attend to technology because that is going to be the single largest influence on those kinds of events to understand what's going to happen. And so, but a Christian account of the future, Adventus, this idea of arrival or advent, right? The particular liturgical season as we're waiting for the arrival of at least the first coming of Christ, but certainly the second coming of Christ, there's a certain advent. It's the future is God's future, is Christ's future, right? And so one's hope doesn't derive from the potential conditions of our own technological creations, or even our potential to bring about goods in the world, and what I would say ultimate goods in the world, right? Sure, are we invited into, that kind of kingdom? Are we the hands and feet of it? Absolutely. Can AI have a role in that? Sure, if we use it wisely and well, but that depends upon, our our own salvation, of sanctification, lots of things that we depend on in the kind of the Christian tradition. But ultimately, that hope derives not from our own kinds of capabilities, but ultimately from a God who saves us and who is bringing us to that future.
Yeah, it's something that doesn't necessarily happen.
Yeah, it's something that Christians, obviously struggle with in every age, is this wildly careening between the stuff we're building is going to bring about the kingdom of God, and everything's going to burn and we're going to go away to heaven. And how do we sort of, I guess I always think of Augustine here, whereas the sense that the kind of ultimate goods are sort of proximate goods are sort of ordered to the ultimate goods, but that there's like an excess of grace functioning in the nexus of causes that's bringing about something beyond anything we can do. And technology is so interesting. I mean, I think also, we've talked about this some, but we're in a moment when there's a very broad cultural belief that sort of proximate goods are brought about by a strong economy. No other questions, just a strong economy. So the only question is, does AI make the economy stronger? And if so, then don't, just let it do its thing. And that sense of like, what kinds of goods lead to human flourishing? What, helps us sort of secure those goods? What role does this play here? I just think it's interesting. People rarely are asking or answering any of those questions. They're just saying, this probably is going to make some money and that'll be good for the economy. I wonder how you think about sort of the how those things get tied together, right? Technology is sort of integrated in all these other systems, and sort of what are the conditions of the possibility that Christians could even like have a say in what any of that means for us and our communities.
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot there. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The problem is that contemporary secular culture doesn't like talking about ultimate goods, right? That's something you can do behind closed doors, in your kind of personal life. And so therefore, the only types of appropriate speech is about the proximate goods, right? But unfortunately, in this day and age, where if all we're talking about are proximate goods, that almost always that is derivative of what Jacques Ellul would say in a technological society, just means the measure is efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, efficiency being a means towards some end, but nobody knows what the end actually is.
And the whole idea, at least in Ellul's understanding of efficiency, is that actually is intentionally meant to eclipse us from speaking about what those ends might be, but instead it's just focusing on the most expedient means to get to one other, some other kind of ends that we don't actually think about, or at least we don't even really think about ordering proximate ends in any kind of substantial way, right? I mean, this is where I think John Milbank's kind of understanding of modernity as kind of as just being kind of Hobbesian. It really is just about a kind of efficient, it's just about which power exceeds another, and it's like, and that's why that we don't have the language or discourse available to us to even begin to kind of think about this in the most appropriate way.
Right. Like the only goods that other goods are ordered to is like your retirement fund or something, right? And then like otherwise everything's just kind of random and chaotic. And it's like, as long as things are efficient, it doesn't matter sort of what we're grabbing with them. And I do think that's why, when we sort of say like, well, we just need to use AI well, I'm sort of like, I don't know that we have the language to talk about using anything well, let alone increasingly powerful technologies. Like what,
That's a very good point.
How would we go about doing that?
Yeah, well, and I think this is why the most, the Pope's recent encyclical was so good, because it was that's the conversation we need to be having. Otherwise, it is just the arms race of different LLMs who are suspicious and distrustful of each other, right? Because we don't know what values are kind of going to kind of driving those kind of things. But it's like, it is just about How do we reach a place of monopoly and power, either out of fear because we think the amount of power and influence the other will have will be worse, or it is just I need to make the most amount of money for my investors. Or actually, I need to return. I actually have to make a return on my investment first.
Right.
But that's what's driving it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where this encyclical was so good, because it's like, no. We need to take a step back and think about why are we towards what end are we pursuing this? What vision?
Yeah. What's
where is our hope coming from?
Mm-hmm.
What is the vision? Is it Babel? Or is it Nehemiah's rebuilding of?
Yeah, that segues nicely into the conversation about hope, because we need to see signs of hope, especially on this podcast, if the podcast is meant to confront challenges with hope. So, but it's not just a question of having hope, as you pointed out, because transhumanists have a lot of hope, but what their hope is in is completely different to what Christians would put their hope in. So what's the source of hope, and what's the object of hope when we're thinking about AI and LLMs in particular?
So from a Christian perspective, I think I'd want to say that hope in AI, there is real hope in AI. If it's wielded well to serve the common good, if it can help, create the kinds of conditions of, economic abundance that actually gets distributed, properly, that attends to the marginalized, that's oriented towards, the kind of a virtuous personal and communal life, right? So if AI can contribute to those kinds of things, which I think there are potentially ways in which it can, right? I'm always amazed when considering new technologies that the positive areas that people reach to first are almost always, related to kind of medical applications, right?
Yeah.
Well, if it helps us to better identify, let's say, some kind of app that can help us with screening for melanoma and different types of skin cancers. Oh my goodness! Of course, that is an application which is ordered to good, and there's hope in that, right? But when it kind of gets elevated to kind of being the transhumanist vision of vulnerability and limitations that dizzy us, and bedazzle us away from our understanding of being creatures, and creatures that need to care for the least of these, who have a particular mandate to care for all of creation, right? Which can certainly include AI, but it's when we make too much of it, I think, that it becomes an issue of despair rather than of hope, or not despair, of false hope, which in some ways might be worse than despair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's just idolatry, right? It becomes godlike, or, it's to go back to Augustine, it's loving the wrong things in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often think, hope, we say hope in multiple ways, right? Because there's the theological virtue of hope, which is, hope in God to secure the goods that we seek. And then but we can say, we hope in any sort of arduous good that we think is possible. And I think it's interesting because ultimately I always kind of say, like, if we're thinking about, like, true hope calls us to faithfulness rather than success, right? The idea that God works through our faithfulness in ways that we can't see, and that much of what we call failure is nonetheless, brought into good things by God. And that, I think, is the piece that I often really struggle to integrate into conversations about things like AI, is kind of, like, what does faithfulness look like when we engage technology? because basically, right, the culture is sort of like we would sacrifice all faithfulness if there was enough success on the table with these things. And so, yeah, for me, I think that's always kind of the question is like, how would you even frame this for the wider culture? What would that look like? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's sort of how I tend to think about hope here.
I've certainly thought about this and commented on this before, that I think there's a way in which you can tap into people's conceptions of the value of radical hope that exceeds just the kind of immediate payoff or kind of impact, right? So, and a lot of this I think has to do with just recognizing that bad things happen to bad people. And that oftentimes, the benefit of this is what the apocalyptic imagination is all about. It comes about at a time when no amount of perception of the current conditions, personal, social, economic, reveal anything like a positive outcome. Mm-hmm. And this is where like genuine religious hope has kind of value, because it is the hope of the single mother in the barrio who doesn't know how they're going to get their food next, right? And like this is a genuinely important hope to wake up and to kind of continue, right? And I think it has to go back to people recognizing those kinds of vulnerabilities in their own life, right? That it's like that just exceeds one's own agency or even the conditions that are imminently within one's own kind of purview. And it's kind of like, we recognize the value of that, the kind of look to the east on the third day, as Gandalf says, right? And Helm's Deep, so to speak, right? It's a hope against hope, that there's real value.
Yeah. I think the philosopher Gabriel Marcel said that hope can't have too concrete an object, because then it becomes a false hope. If you're hoping very specifically that something will happen tomorrow, or, whereas if you're just, what makes hope a theological virtue is when you don't know exactly what the outcome's going to be, but you're still confident that whatever it is, God is in control and God is going to guide it and God is sovereign over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where optimism is often the more dangerous thing, because if we're very optimistic about a specific outcome and then it doesn't happen, then we fall into despair. Whereas pessimism is kind of like, I don't know if we're going to pull this off, but nonetheless, sort of hope can survive in the midst of that.
Well, and I think there's also something about, this is kind of one of the ways in which I end that book on eschatology, which is very germane to this understanding of the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism almost always is about, I hope this particular set of circumstances kind of comes about, whereas hope is interpersonal. It's hoping in, it's a virtue that like I depend on somebody else, that their promise is going to, that they've made to me is going to be fulfilled, and they're going to make do on it. And so it is, it is an understanding of kind of faithfulness, right? And so that hope in kind of technology isn't in our kind of technical acumen, or that like things will just happen to end up well, but it is a form of faithfulness that, thank God the future is God's, because he is ordering everything towards its kind of good, and we have been promised, right, a kingdom of glory and ultimate communion with him and with everything in the created order, right? So it turns everything towards that interpersonal, right, and it makes that ultimate rather than zeros and ones, and if I just calculate things properly, everything will be okay. And it's like, that's not the right domain of significance and kind of meaning, it seems to me, that will deliver on that kind of hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess the main thing with all of the fears about AI, about people losing their jobs, or about it destroying the climate, or about it just destroying higher education, I guess it just helps for Christians to be reminded that our hope comes from something far beyond those things, and also that hope doesn't mean that those terrible things aren't going to happen.
Yeah.
Because our hope goes above and beyond that. Our hope goes to the source of all reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so much that I think the hope in technology often is a kind of fatalism, right? Where it says like, there's nothing really we can do here, but the people who make the technologies will surely in the end figure it out and things will be okay. And so we just go along because there's, we don't have a say in the outcome one way or another. And that, right, that's very opposite of the sense of hope of, even if we can't be successful, we can be faithful, and that faithfulness has meaning because ultimately it rests in hands bigger than ours, right?
Well, and I probably even want to push that even further. So it isn't just that God stands at the end of history or something that, but, the Paraclete is with us, the Spirit is guiding. He, a good dose of providence, of God being as intimate to us as we are to ourselves. That hope isn't just something that is far away, but because of the incarnation, and even before that, right? If you have a good logos Christology, God is as near to us in kind of creation, and therefore that is also a kind of medium of hope as well.
Yeah, that's right. And that again, I think is that really difficult line to walk of like, that doesn't mean tragedy won't happen. That doesn't mean our whole civilization won't be destroyed, because those things happen. And yet there is hope in the midst of it, right? In the kind of day-to-day living of the things.
That God is working his purposes in history, even if we can't see where or how.
Yeah.
That there's, because we have such a limited view of history, we have our attention, drawn towards certain things by the news and by the media and by whatever day-to-day activities we have to get involved with. But there's just so much more almost infinitely much more going on than we can possibly process or take in. And there's so much scope for the Holy Spirit being at work in some of those places where we just don't know and couldn't know.
Yeah, the whole idea of the kingdom of God being amongst you, it has arrived. Christ has inaugurated it, and it can be the momentum, right, for the Dorothy Days of the world and the Mother Teresa's, to be the kind of hands and feet of the really specific smaller acts of kind of hope, right, that are the harbingers and microcosms, right, of that kind of hope, right? So it's a call to not retreat, right, but it's a call to be one that enacts, I guess.
And this is where I think I find really helpful this conversation, because when we do talk about, okay, we as individuals need to use these tools well, I think that the calling is, if our lives are oriented to those kinds of goods, and we find AI helpful in that, then we might be using it well. And the challenge is that our lives are often not oriented to those kinds of goods, and that the more we use technology, often the more it pushes our lives to be oriented to other kinds of goods. And so I think framing those challenges in those ways, I find really helpful, because it's not just like, all right, whatever you do with your life, just use AI well. But it is actually a sort of challenge to everything that we do and are, if we're going to, be thoughtful about those things.
I mean, I think there's also something initially that also makes technology just a lot harder, because it's sold to us as convenience of, you can offload the things that you don't want to do. And yet the virtuous life requires precisely those habituses, that consistent kind of practice. I mean, effort, of course, through sacramental life, we're, given grace upon grace, to enable us to do that. But there is a siren's call with technology to alleviate us of, well, it's a siren's call that, can be like, just work is bad in the first place.
Right.
Effort is bad. If you can arrive at it has an inherent kind of consequentialist tone. If you can get the thing you want without the effort, isn't that what you want to do?
I think that's the temptation, isn't it? That most of the enthusiasm about AI, we've talked a lot about the fear about AI, but the enthusiasm about AI outside of very specific spheres is, this is just going to make my life easier.
Yeah.
This is just going to mean that I don't have to do a bunch of things that I've had to do before.
Yeah.
And then that raises the question, is making my life easier what my life is all about?
Yeah. That's right. And AI especially, right? Because it then is saying, especially the creative things that you used to do that also were hard, now you don't have to do those.
Yeah.
And those are like, okay, some things I'm like, if we get something to take out the trash for me, fine. But, if it's going to do these other things, I think for me, this is where I see it's such a deeply alluring and tragic thing that the specific.
Yeah. Somebody to write my novel for me. Like I saw Michael I don't remember where it was, but you seem familiar with Isaac Asimov and his robot science fiction, because I saw reference to that in some of your writings. Yeah. And there's this one Isaac Asimov short story, which seems like ridiculously prescient now. I think he wrote it in like the 1930s or 40s. Yeah. And it's about a novelist who buys a new computer processor to write his novels on. But the computer processor is so, it is machine learning. So it starts to spell check, and then it starts to complete his sentences, and then at the end it shuts down for 3 days, and he's devastated because he's gotten really dependent on it. And then when it starts back up again, it starts just writing his novel without him. And I can't believe that he wrote this almost 100 years ago, and now that's exactly what we're experiencing happening right now.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found so evocative of, and maybe it's just because I was raised on, science fiction, that they were within science fiction asking a lot of the proximate and ultimate questions, that technology poses to us, within that kind of narrative format, that I always found it to be so friendly to kind of theology, because it was kind of like, because science fiction had become a genre that people have just become so aware of, right? I often find myself as a touch point going back to some kind of story or something that people have read or watched or something like this as being important to kind of considering, well, what are those futures if we were to take 3 steps, 5 steps, 10, 15, 20, 30, to then kind of say, like, is this the kind of reality we want to live in? Is this the kind of person I want to be, right? That then makes you actually reflect upon, is this a good decision in the present then? Is this the way I ought to be using it? Should I be developing it in this kind of way? I found it so important.
Got a whole podcast episode on the value of science fiction, just to plug a previous episode.
Yeah.
I'll
listen to that one, sir.
Any sort of concluding thoughts or final statement?
I mean, I guess I would probably just say that more and more I'm focusing on, who do we need to be to wield AI well? And that often that's not the question that is often asked. And if we ask that question a lot more, and also, how is the AI shaping us to be is it shaping us to be the kinds of people that can actually wield and provide proper oversight of the AI well? And if not, then how should we change the AI development, and what do we need to be doing as people to, develop those particular kinds of virtues, those kinds of relationships? But that's, probably
it's a great question, and it's almost such a big question that I think it's off-putting, because people don't want to ask such a big question. That's like, oh, how do I even begin? But it is the right sort of starting point. It sets you in the right direction if you ask that question, I think.
I wrote something a fair bit ago on Frankenstein, and part of this isn't just who do we need to be to use it. I mean, you can ask this in any kind of right. Who do we need to be to create it? And that person, and I think Frankenstein and Creature provide such an interesting story as to how the dispositions, the virtues, the intentions of the creator get embedded into the kind of technology, right? I mean, and I think this is something within the Christian tradition that we kind of recognize, that what's required of the iconographer in terms of their own personal holiness, the preparation that's required to create that, the kind of artifact. So thinking about who we are in relation to the things that we create and the way that we use is one of the areas that just requires so much more consideration. That's what I would say.
Well, we will look forward to seeing what sorts of considerations you produce as you address this question.
Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for joining us. It's been a very rich discussion. Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.